Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on changes and interactions along the rural-urban gradient. My name is Jasper van Vliet. I co-chair this session together with Anton van Rompaey and Torben Birch-Thomsen. And I'd like to briefly introduce it. What you see here on the slide is a very, I would say, dichotomous view of rural-urban. It's either urban, dense, high buildings, or it's rural, in this case agriculture, and it's got a clear dividing line. And many studies in land use science actually use this as a conceptual model to study either urban or rural systems. Now probably I don't need to tell you, because you're here, that in reality they are not as separate as it appears to be in this picture. In reality, first of all, there's often something like a gradient from urban to rural, with villages or peri-urban landscapes. And also, there are many other interactions. There's flows of people, of commodities, of money maybe, of information, of other things going back and forth between the rural and the urban. Now, these interactions and the change in these interactions, that inspired us to propose this session. And that's what we have a couple of presenters discussing various aspects of these interactions. This session is not standalone. It is actually organized, at least partly, on behalf of the working group on rural-urban interactions. You've heard this morning in introductory talks of Pete Messerly already that since about 1.5 years, the Global End program has a couple of working groups. This is one of the 6. We started, therefore, indeed 1.5 years ago. We have so far organized our first workshop, and we're employing some other activities. And I would like to use this opportunity to already cordially invite everyone that is not yet a member to join us. It's a bit of a bottom-up initiative, so I don't have a set agenda of activities that you can sign up for after you have become a member of our group. Instead, it is also an invitation to actually help initiate new activities in this context. One of the activities that we're having, which is also related to this session, is that we're organizing a special issue in the Journal of Land Use Science. And the people that are presenting in this session, but also others that work on this topic but maybe present in another session, I would hereby cordially like to invite you to submit to this special issue. The website mentioned the deadline already at the end of next month. But I talked to Danielle Müller, the editor, recently, and we are able to stretch that for, say, until the summer. So don't be stressed, you got a little more time, and it would be great if we can find some additional contributions to this journal. Good, then for this session, the session actually consists of 2 parts. We'll have 6 presentations today, and there's another 5, if I'm correct, tomorrow at 10:45, right? So this is only the half of the entire presentation. The presentations are listed here. There's one change relative to the schedule that was presented in the WOVA app and elsewhere on the website, which is that the 3rd presentation on rural-urban transformation, small towns and climate change-induced migration is cancelled. So we have a little more time, but I would like to ask the presenters to not use that time, because probably we'll, need a little more time anyway with all the discussions. So we'll first have 4 full presentations and then 2 flash talks. I won't read out loud all the titles. You can read them in the app and they'll be introduced individually. With that, I'd like to close this introduction and now hand over to Anton, who will moderate this session, and I hope you find it interesting.
Like this. Hello. Yes. Also on my behalf, well, welcome to this session. I will do the moderation, and I'm known to be a very sharp time manager, so I'll show that characteristic here today. So 12 minutes and then 3 minutes discussion. And we'll start with Torben Birch-Thomsen on urban centers in Tanzania. Torben, the floor is yours and the time is running. That's a joke, huh?
Please. You can keep this one. Can it, I'm very short-necked, so I get it.
Just don't look down too much.
Can you do it? There's some physical barriers here.
There you go.
That's going to be weird.
Do you have another one? Do you want maybe to try that one?
Is that longer?
You can click it basically.
Oh, yes. Yes. Sorry for the... Is time still running?
Sorry. There you go. So that's just we can put it if it's okay like that. Now it should work.
Hello.
Yeah, I love it there. Okay.
It's this
all
one.
done, yeah. Or put it in your pocket or something. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for the delay. I'd also like to welcome you. Hope you enjoy the break and the nice weather outside. I'm going to start, as Jasper mentioned, this gradient between the rural and urban. We also talk about the continuum between rural and urban. And I'll try to take you to the more rural side of the urban, into what we call emerging urban centers, small rural villages that are growing to become urban centers and getting urban status. Yes, I think we'll just... well, first I'll try to explain what we mean by emerging urban centers, then I'll take you a little bit about into the history of urbanization in Tanzania and where do we find these small urban centers. Something about where are they, how can we actually see them, map them, and then some characteristics of the developments and some of the challenges, end up with some challenges of these urban centers. This figure here is from a recent publication we had, where we try to illustrate and show what we mean by emerging urban centers. So in Tanzania we have villages, townships, and towns, and they are defined by a larger area. Particularly in the village case, we have an urban center, or the CBD of a town or a city and so on. So this busy area, and this is what we call the emerging urban centers in these otherwise rural landscapes. And the timeline here illustrates that they move in Tanzania from a status of a village into being announced as a township by the local government. They establish a council that's increasing the status of a township as kind of a local government, but still under the control of the local government, meaning the district. And eventually they move into, or could move into, becoming towns. And that's a real urban entity, also a different, within the administrative levels, it's an urban entity where the district, the local government is a rural entity. So, so we are trying to, would like to try and show you that this process here, the reason for this line moving like this is that the timeline or defined time for this process is open. There's no deadline, there's no kind of, when you start this process, you can expect within 5 years, 10 years. And in the case of these centers we've looked into, they are all more than 10 to 15 years in this process of becoming a town and not yet reached the stage. So some of these processes are very slow, but what we try to show is that that's on the governance part, but what is happening on the ground is actually happening very fast. And that's where the land transition comes in. This is just to illustrate, we have 4 locations. I'll not say so much about all of them, but a bit on Ilula and Kibaigwa. They are divided into two types of urban centers. The two here have a marketplace, and the other has manufacturing. In this case here, sugar, and here it's tea. So they have developed around a market or a manufacturing of an agricultural product. Up here it's maize market, and here it's tomato. So when we started looking into these areas, I mean, obviously you could see that these were developing, following over the years, but where do they fit into the development of urban areas or built-up areas in Tanzania? And I will refer to this homepage here, Africa Police, where they map, and you can follow for each country, a development of this urban settlements. And I'll just click it on here and go back again. Oops. So we have the large urban centers, the former capital here. We have Dodoma somewhere in here. And you see in the beginning very few of these very small centers. As we click through, the number is increasing. Some of the small centers are developing into larger urban centers. So it's a moving target this year. So some of them are staying small, others are moving into the urban hierarchy. And this is just to show how they have identified this built-up area that they are classifying through housing and population censuses, satellite imagery. They have built-up area and precise location of these settlements, and then the administrative boundaries that are how they define these areas. You can look it up more here. And if we look into these 4 places that we have identified, this is Ilula. Here we have Kibaigwa, Madisini, and then Iguole. And as you can see, they, in the form, shape, are very different, and very much the development of these small centers are governed also by the landscape and the physical ability of expansion. Either it's along the roads, because that's the most feasible, or as you saw this one here, where we have it's a very flat area, so you can expand in all directions. Now, these overlays here are what they call built-up areas. So when you zoom into the map, it will give you the physical area on the map, and here, but not so much the detail of the area. And here we have overlaid the Sentinel built-up classification, which enables us to see the different houses, individual houses. So we can see something about density of these places. So they are not developing in a uniform area. It's like with different density and the development. We were interested to try and see if we could say something about the history and what the history meant for these places. In the 70s, we had Ujamaa, which was a villagization in Tanzania, where you move people into these villages. And this is the map of one of the areas, and we can see 3 kind of centers defined by the government moving people into these rural villages. We wanted to try and see if we could map the development back in time. So what we just saw, both the Sentinel and the Africa Police, was pretty much a snapshot of how it is now or at a certain year. So we try to compare the extent here from the Sentinel to the Landsat, and then going back in time. And I'll just show you quickly here. You can see how these 3 places are developing into one uniform urban area. One of our PhD students have also looked at the transition from cropland into urban area in this period, just within 10 years, 113% increase in this built-up area. This is just to illustrate. We did a survey within this area, identified as what we call the EOC, and And if we look at the different developments, we see a lot of different types of area. The very old settlements here are very dense, crowded, no road structures. There's no road leading to all the houses. So giving a lot of challenges in terms of service provision. Some of the more newly developed areas, now you start seeing structures and you see road access to all houses and also a possibility to actually provide, for instance, piped water and other services. And then we have in the fringe of these areas a more unstructured development where people are buying up land or getting access to land and building houses, and that's where some of the expansion is taking place. I'll try to illustrate this with this Kibaika case. One of our master students did look into the density of houses. We wanted to capture the latest development because it's really rapid what is happening. So this is in 2009, the density of houses. And here we have it in 1516 using the Sentinel data. And if we look at the where are these new added houses between these two years coming, we see development of new kind of sub-villages or clusters of settlements showing up in completely new areas up here. And we'll have a closer look at this area. This is the 2009 houses mapped, and at that time nothing was here. Then in the 1516, these are the new added one, increase of 27%. And between 16 and then 1990, these were mapped as new settlements coming in. So that illustrates some of the expansion, and a lot of different land conflicts shows up in these areas. It has some consequences. Here we have the fringe and the urban center, different access to different services, water access and electricity that illustrates to some extent the difference between the old settlements and the new settlements. But for instance, access of water here is a big issue when you are in the fringe compared to in the center. On the other hand, when we look at electricity, we see a large group here not having access to electricity, which is basically in the old settlements, the old houses in these urban centers. Ownership and land tenure is another issue, kind of similar illustrations. Just to say that it's not just the opening, the urban centers, but also the linkages between the rural and urban areas. And this is from another master student trying to show this complex link between the Manyata, which is a hinterland rural village, and the Kibaika, the urban center, and then links to other larger urban centers, but also other rural areas through labor migration and the agricultural production and other centers. So these are very complex rural-urban linkages that exist both in short, medium, and long distances. So winding up, the rural-urban transformation challenges. We have looked at some issues. These are results from a workshop we were having with stakeholders a month ago in Tanzania, in Dodoma. And these are some of the outcomes of that workshop, our own work and discussions. And it shows that there's a huge need for governance to try and lead this development. A number of issues were identified. This about the rural and urban, different livings within the urban centers. We have both rural livelihoods and urban livelihoods. We have to go beyond the agricultural and land use issues. This is very intense in the Tanzanian debate, and not much focus on the urban part. Service provision, particularly when uncontrolled land use transitions is a big issue, and land issues in general. But the overall is that these developments actually have a huge positive feedback to the rural hinterlands. And these are just to give you some ideas of some of the inputs that we have used, our partners, and some publications. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Torben, for this interesting talk. I can imagine there are some questions about this topic for Torben. Yes?
Right from the beginning, you discussed about this whole change in continuum framework.
Yes.
I doubt that it really is, that there are possibly also jumping points, there are breaks, and it may not be as linear as you have shown.
Oops. If we go back to the figure up here, I think this process that we are trying to capture with this transition from, I mean, when I said the continuum, it was the whole continuum from very rural to the big cities. That's normally talked about in like a continuum. I think what we're looking, and maybe there that you'll find jumps, I agree. But for this part here, where we are at the very start of this development.
But it looks like a straight line.
No, it's not at all. That's why I try to show that this is not, it is moving, then it's not moving. These people are, in the local government, in the townships, are eager to become towns because that means that they will get economic independency of the district. But the districts are normally holding back because they get the revenue from these places. So they're captured in between. And one of the discussions we had at this workshop was that could you actually imagine any of these townships that they would never develop into a town? And I think that's the big question. And yes, you can, because they're kept back. And the problem is that they stay then in a rural governance system and not actually getting an urban planning and urban management or governance.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more short question. Yes, you were first, sorry. The other one will be in the break.
So when you ask for ownership, you ask only for the house, like the plot where the house was built, or is it also like the size of the plot, and if there's also something like urban gardening, or if they are like the subsistence urban dwellers, or is it
I could have shown one of the other cases where one of these new planned areas is actually a proper plot where you actually see some crops grown as well. So it's an urban gardening, you could say. It could be maize, but it could be a lot of vegetables, fruit trees, and so on. But that's where they have plots of a size where you both can have your house and have some gardens. But in a lot of these places, it's simply a house put on the ground, and in some cases, it's you just buy the plot where you build the house, very, very small, or people, if I have land, I build a house or several houses on my land, and then I rent it out, and I may sell them off as small pieces later on. So it's, yeah, you see the whole range, and we got that information, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So now the ice is broken and we can move to the second speaker, which is Jasper van Vliet. We'll actually move your stuff.
Hello. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Jasper will entertain us with a story on 50 Shades of Grey or something related. Several shades of grey, sorry, yes, okay, I'm sorry for that stupid joke.
I consciously did not refer to the 50 Shades of Grey. Actually, I removed it here altogether as the title was way too long. But
okay, good. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jasper, the floor is yours.
Sure, I'll take the embarrassment, no
Good
problem.
luck.
Good. I'd like to zoom out a little bit. So we just learned about individual towns, village development in Tanzania. But what I would like to present here is really the representation of rural-urban gradient in land use models, or the absence of that. And it's at least partly the result of the work I did while I was visiting WSL, the group of Anna Hershberger, last year. And I'm happy to have some results now at least. So this is the starting point. This is a movie of the CLUE model results, but I don't think CLUE is unique in this. I think this represents, well, pretty much all of the large-scale land use models I am aware of, where land use classes are divided in urban, typically one class, you see it here in red, and non-urban, often a larger number of classes, which you see here in 50 Shades of Green, if I may refer to your title. And so the whole point here is that I can simulate an impact of urban growth on maybe loss of cropland or other things, but there is no way in which I can use these models as a laboratory to understand urban growth itself. I mean, all I can do is maybe find where the next pixel is located. And that is a bit simplistic if you consider this rural-urban gradient. So first I started testing this assumption. What I did is we used the global human settlements layer, which is 30-meter resolution originally, and we assessed how built-up land was distributed over pixels. Now, I know from experience these graphs require a bit of explanation. So you see here exactly 20 bins, each representing a 5% bin. So the first one is between 0 and 5, 5 and 10, 10 and 15%. That's the percentage of the pixel that is built-up land. What you see in the y-axis is the percentage of all built-up land in the country. So basically I'm showing here a distribution. What you see on the left side is that it's a rather equal distribution in the Netherlands. So there is about, 6% of all the built-up land is in pixels that are almost completely built up. But there's also about 6% of all built-up land in the pixels between 0 and 5%. If we look at other countries, however, we see that this distribution becomes more skewed. So if you look at Switzerland, you already see that there's a much larger share of the built-up land in pixels that are predominantly non-built-up, because this is all 0, 5, 5, 10, 10 to 15%. And if we go to Romania, we see that the distribution is even more skewed. That means that the vast majority of the built-up land is in pixels that will probably not be represented as urban in these models here, right? They're actually the agricultural land or maybe even some forested areas. So that got us started thinking we need to improve that a little bit. So with that in mind, we made a new classification of urban land in China. Now, this is not a remote sensing exercise. This is a post-classification. So we try to differentiate different types of, well, what we call settlements, different settlement systems. Resolution here is 2 by 2 kilometers. And of course, there's the large cities. Those are the large clusters. You will recognize 3 probably. Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou are clearly visible. Some other, Chengdu and Wuhan is there, so here in the middle. So there's a few of these big cities, but it's actually only a small part of China. And you see a much larger area indicated with the green and the yellow shades. I must say everything that is gray doesn't have any built-up land, right? So I'm focusing on the part with built-up land. And you see there's a complete, well, a range here, obviously. Now, it's clear the classification is arbitrary. I mean, we set these thresholds, so you got me there. But what I want to show here is that there's a much larger area outside the big cities that we all know about that still can be characterized by their settlement systems. And if we sum that up, you see here in the bars at the top, that's for 3 different years, we see how much of the total land of China it includes. Well, the vast majority is actually deep rural, no buildup, and then there's about 20% of land that has some buildup, and only a very small part of that is in large cities and urban areas. Yeah, sure, but what about the built-up land? Well, we also did the same analysis for built-up land. And interestingly, the 3 classes that are predominantly urban, large cities, urban landscapes, suburban landscapes, they They grow over time, yes, but they're still a small minority of the built-up land. So the vast majority of all the built-up land, and therefore all the different settlements, are actually in these village systems here. And that's what we normally miss if we don't include that. We also analyzed changes over time. And what these arrows show, the width is proportional to the total land area representing one change. And we only included the arrows that are the most important ones, leaving every class. Now, it's a bit of a complicated figure in a sense, but what we learn from it is that also the changes are not sudden. There's hardly any change from deep rural to large city. Instead, what we find, and that corresponds perfectly with what you just told me, is that we find all small and incremental changes. So deep rural areas become sparse villages. Isolated villages become sparse villages. Sparse villages become sparsely clustered towns, and so on and so forth. So the frame of having a non-urban to urban conversion is not something we found in the data. Actually, we found these small incremental and gradual changes. But there's more. So far, this was all based on built-up area, so it's kind of only what you see from above. But if you look at urban areas, there can be different types of changes. So you have the expansion. Now, this is obviously space-time substitution. It's not the same village, but it's got the same type of building structure. This one is just larger. But there's also large differences in density. You see here is an American suburb, and here you see Hong Kong-style flats. So the intensity, which you can measure maybe in population density or building volume or economic activity, can also vary greatly between different areas. So also that is something we analyzed. What you see here, again, for the same three countries and for three time periods, so this is 1975, 1990, 1990, 2000, and so on, we combined the change in population with the change in built-up area. And red relates to the population in new built-up land. So we saw that in the Netherlands, in this period, the population increase is almost completely accommodated by an increase in built-up area. And at the same time, we see that the existing built-up land actually decreased a little bit in population density. And over time, we see some changes. So the built-up land related to new population decreased, and actually there's a small, what we can call intensification in existing urban areas in more recent periods. Now, interestingly, these patterns varied greatly between different countries. So in Switzerland, we saw that in the 1975-1990 period, all new population was accommodated by new built-up land. But in the most recent period, the vast majority of the population increase actually led to intensification of existing built-up land. Oh, sorry. And in Romania, we actually find the other change in the other direction, where, for example, in the most recent period, we see a decline in population density in existing urban areas, and only a small increase in new built-up areas. Now, these relate probably to many different socio-economic and demographic processes. I mean, I can speculate about them, about family sizes changing, about rural to urban migration. We haven't explored that. The point is that we see changes both in urban area and in urban intensity, and they differ in time and in areas. So that is what we try to include in a recent model application that we developed, and I'd like to present it only as a prototype. It's really a test of can we simulate the different expansion and intensification changes. So we made a similar classification that is based both on built-up land, but also on population density and even on economic activity. So you see here, for example, a differentiation between industrial villages and traditional villages. That relates to the share of the population working in agriculture and the share of the population working in manufacturing and services. Now, I'm well aware it's a little difficult to see here on the map. This, by the way, is the province of Jiangsu in eastern China. So for your reference, Shanghai is here. It's just not in this province, but it's the largest city that most people can relate to. What we see, if you look carefully, is again the same type of gradual change that we could simulate. So what we found in the data before, in the spatial analysis, we could also simulate in our model a gradual increase from spread traditional villages typically to clustered traditional villages to peri-urban landscape and so on. And we fed this model with a demand initially for population. So we said housing or accommodating population, that is what drives this urbanization. In addition, because that's a very important policy target in China, we also combined that with different cropland protection policies. The traditional one is one where we protect the total area of cropland. That is in various ways or has been implemented in policies. We also looked at an alternative, and I'd like to present these results here. What you see here is exactly 6 different scenarios, and I show the change in net built-up land, in net cropland change, in net production change. Now first about these scenarios. Number 1, 3, and 5 have the same population scenario. So you can see here that the 1, 3, and 5, that the amount of built-up land expansion differs, even though they have the same increase in population. The same for 2, 4, and 6. They have a larger increase in population, but still the same for these 3, and the amount of built-up land increase differs. Now, why does it differ? And that you can see here. So in scenario 1 and 2, we did not include any cropland protection. So what you see here is that built-up land increases relatively much, and most of it translates into a decrease in cropland. Jiangsu is also a very convenient case study area for that because almost all land is either cropland or built-up land. And that leads to also considerable losses in crop production. Now, if we go to number 3 and 4, we implemented the no net loss policies in China. You couldn't lose any cropland. Well, you see a small loss here. That is due to the implementation in the model. We allow for a small error margin to find a solution. And we see that it results actually in a smaller increase in built-up land. And that means that instead of having agricultural systems turning into villages, instead we find that there's a larger increase towards the denser urban systems, requiring much less area per person. But we still found that there is a large loss or a considerable loss in crop production because the most intensively managed croplands are in this area found next to the cities, and those were the ones that were lost. So, and these were compensated often by new croplands, for example, in the coastal areas where there's land reclamation, but that's not the most productive areas. So we could maintain the amount of cropland area, but lose crop production. So you fulfill the requirements of the policy, but it doesn't really help for what you're actually aiming for, which is food security. So we implemented a third scenario where we characterized all the agricultural systems also by their food production. And we said, now instead of having a no net loss of cropland area, we implement a no net loss of crop production. And we see that in this scenario, relative to 3 and 4, we find that there's actually a larger increase in built-up land. And there's also a significant decrease in cropland, but we could maintain all crop production, partly due to intensification. Now, once again, this is a prototype. I mean, to some extent, it's heavily influenced by the assumptions we make. But what I would like to show with this example is that by parameterizing your model to not include built-up land, non-built-up land, but instead different types, and using population density and crop production instead of just area, you can actually study alternative urbanization pathways and look for solutions that you cannot normally find with the type of model we started with. So I guess that's what I'd like to present to you, and there's much to say about improving it, and I think it opens up a lot of opportunities to explore these land use change processes in much more detail. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jasper. Questions for Jasper on this topic? Yes?
Yes.
How do you actually classify? What are the parameters to classify the different
I anticipated that question would come up. So this is for the all of China, where first we exclude water bodies, and then so we use 3 parameters. It's the size of the cluster, it's the share of built-up land, and it's the number of clusters within a small area. Now, I won't go over all parameters, but I very much agree that the threshold values, they are arbitrary. We played around a little bit. What we found is that changing the thresholds logically does change, pushes the boundary of the system back and forth a little bit, but it doesn't really qualitatively change the image that we found.
Like on the Netherlands also?
Not this one, no.
Okay, another question from Jette. You the first, I think. Yeah,
Okay.
then you.
I'll just congratulate you with that paper. I think it's a good way of showing that the increase in productivity actually sort of is not a zero-sum game, sort of that kind of transition. Have you sort of considered in the paper that this is actually also the Chinese politics doing exactly this, and whether that this kind of scenario is particular in the sense that you have a policy that can rapidly make that kind of transition?
Well, I know that their most recent policies, they don't necessarily protect a certain amount of crop production, also because there's fluctuation, but it's aimed at preserving the most fertile croplands now instead of just the total cropland area. So the simplification that I made is that many of the policies that started since, I think it's the end of the 80s where they started, there was really no loss in area. And increasingly, they're moving to protecting the more fertile croplands. So we indicate that they're going in that direction. However, we couldn't really quantify proper implementation, so we put it just more as a thought experiment of having a no net loss in crop production.
Okay, you were the next one.
Yeah, actually, I was wondering, I think what I'm observing in Ireland is that the fertile land tends to be around the city center. So it's the most prone to development because just of the proximity.
Yep.
So do you find that in your land use in Ireland, in China as well, that the fertile land was actually around the city center?
Not specifically in China, but more generally, yes. And mostly that is for historic reasons that cities started in areas where you could produce a lot of food. So that is obviously true. Within Jiangsu, there is relatively little difference in productivity. The difference that exists is mostly due to management, except for a small strip along the coast here, as this is recently reclaimed land. But I've done another analysis on a global scale where we indeed found that most of the urban expansion is likely to take place in exactly the most fertile areas because that's where the cities are. Yeah, and I also think that is well, I would almost say offers an opportunity space that maybe we should reconsider because these cities at the moment aren't necessarily related to the agricultural land around it. I mean, I'm myself from Amsterdam. The name already indicates why it was there. It was a dam in the River Amstel, and that's because you could have a trade post there. Yeah, that's a nice story in the museum, but it's not the reason that the banking offices are in Amsterdam right now. That's simply because of the spillover effects and like the companies attracting each other. But it has nothing to do with the productivity of the hinterland and the fact that you were a trade post there at this moment. So I do think it's something we could potentially reconsider and maybe look for other directions for urbanization.
Okay, one final short question there in the back.
Thank you very much. Nice work. I was wondering, in the last scenario that you mentioned, where you had intensive urban land use combined with still preserving agricultural land for production.
Yes.
That seems to be a scenario that is only possible with very strict spatial planning, because if that is absent and it's all given to the market forces, the price gradient would shift, would very much force the rural land to transform into urban. Have you thought about the role of spatial planning in the whole process at all, compared to the, I don't know,
I think it does actually require very strict planning because normally in the competition for land, I mean, land prices for urban land are much higher than for agricultural land. Knowing, I'm myself from the Netherlands, as you know, and there it's very strict that it's indicated whether something is urban or non-urban, and there's a lot of speculation. People are buying agricultural land in anticipation of the destination plan, as it's called, indicating that it will become urban afterwards because all of a sudden the land is worth, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times as much. And that type of planning is needed to avoid this sprawling effect anyway. And I do think China is doing a relatively good job there. They have strict policies, but I'm aware that in many other countries, such a thing would be very difficult to implement at this moment. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Other questions will be for the break, I think. That brings us, I think, needlessly to the next talk, which is on spatial planning, on strategic spatial plans. And I would like to call Eduardo da Silva.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Exactly, now we will discuss about spatial planning, more specifically about strategic spatial plans, but first I would like to say thank you to the organizers for accepting our contribution. A contribution developed by me, Eduardo, together with Anne Asperger. I currently work as a postdoc at the University Catholique de Louvain at Louvain-la-Neuve, and Anne Asperger at the Swiss Federal Research Institute, where I worked between 2016 and 2018. And the main goal of this presentation, and hopefully a paper in the near future, is to investigate specifically the role of these strategic spatial plans at the urban regional level and the way they deal with this urban-rural divide with the urban-rural linkage. And if you are less familiar with spatial planning or with strategic spatial plans, putting it simple, probably the transportation you use to come to Bern probably somehow the result of a strategic spatial plan, or at least as we envision it in a strategic spatial plan, probably operationalized through other policies or other planning instruments. And we are all aware, and you have been working with this topic certainly longer than myself, that talking about only urban and rural areas is certainly no longer feasible. As also Jasper mentioned earlier, there are several events affecting, contributing to this complex urban-rural gradient, being urbanization, only one of the examples, migration patterns as well, and we also have population growth in some cases, and also shrinkage in others, and consequently de-densification. And we certainly also agree that we need new narratives, and we also need new approaches, new actions to deal better with this relationship between urban and rural areas. And we specifically focus on developing this understanding of these complex issues between urban and rural through a planning lens or through the spatial planning domain. And also as this is somehow the way we position ourselves, and we can take this as a starting point into this discussion and our contribution to the urban-rural gradient discussion and debates. And we argue that planning and managing urban areas and rural interrents requires spatial planning strategies as a way to better deal with land use policies and other land use instruments. And from within the domain of spatial planning, we specifically look at strategic spatial plans, plans that usually are prepared in the long term. They usually cover 20 to 50 years, and they have been applied and developed across mainly developed urban regions in Europe and North America since 1970s, around that. And they have been used to guide the location of physical developments, to envisioning future developments, and they involve different domains, social, economic, they involve transportation, they involve the development of urban areas of residential areas, and also green infrastructures, for instance, among many other domains. And we are not alone in this quest of calling for a more for the exploration of the linkage between spatial planning, between strategic spatial plans and land change. The literature also underlined the relevance of exploring or linking strategic spatial plans and land change, and others argue that also land change studies could benefit from a better understanding, from an evaluation of spatial plans and how they deal with land use change, and related areas. And we have been doing that as part of this concours project at the Swiss Federal Research Institute, Me and my colleagues, we have been devoting attention to landscape issues, green infrastructures. There are publications out there you can easily access, land degradation, and then as a way to contribute to this conference, and also hopefully to the special issue on urban-rural divides. By focus specifically on these 3 research questions, and I will briefly go through them, and I will present one example for each somehow. Simply understanding if these strategic spatial plans at the urban regional scale in European and North America urban regions, if they deal with these urban-rural relationships, to what extent they deal, if they include specific policies, specifically measures, or if they point out ways of addressing this issue, and how we can improve strategic spatial plans to deal better with this relationship in a way to contribute to more sustainable urban-rural relationships. And these are our case studies. Most of the cases, we have been dedicating attention to them since the beginning of the project, and then we decided to extend them to North America, and then we include Edmonton and Vancouver in Canada, Portland and Pittsburgh in the United States, and we have 12 cases in Europe. We have been doing research on these European cases through the lens of governance and also of planning conditions and planning intentions in these strategic spatial plans. And because of the availability of strategic spatial plans written in English and accessible through the internet, then we decided to take them as our case studies. They have certainly their differences in terms of population, in terms of their size as well. But they all produce, to some extent, they produce their strategic spatial plans for the urban region. So, in line with the research questions, we did a content analysis. But this is somehow an ongoing process. We certainly will need we could expand this a bit more, eventually integrate in other plans and other policy documents. We did a content analysis of this about 58 strategic spatial plans, and we look specifically for these 10 keywords from urban, rural to land take and countryside. This also reflects the narrative these urban regions and those dealing with strategic spatial planning in these urban regions approach urban-rural relationships. And trying to despise the context sensitiveness of strategic spatial plans, this means that they specifically focus in a certain urban region. They look at their specificities in terms of population, economic background, and development patterns through a period of time. We try to generalize the findings here in this slide. And we point out here that the European cases, these 12 European urban regions, they mostly focus on brownfield redevelopments when they talk about urban-rural relationships or their urban and rural hinterlands. They also propose a number of projects for the reutilization of outdated buildings in rural areas as a way to boost economic development in these rural areas. And some of the cases, they also stimulate polycentricity, which means create different centers in their urban regions and mainly in rural areas. In Canada, those 2 plans, they mainly focus on the protecting agricultural area, protecting the most fertile agricultural lands, mainly for food productions, but they also point out some ways of seeking a more equal developments between urban and rural areas. In the case in the US, urban-rural relationships, they are less debated. They mainly focus on how to control urbanizations, to curb urban sprawl and avoid further land take for urbanization in rural areas. But some of the cases, they also point out ways of developing infrastructures, mainly transportation, to facilitate the economic developments in their rural hinterlands. And this is a table summarizing the findings. The colors is the reflection of our work. Try to find some patterns between the cases. The 3 first cases, we cannot actually relate them with the others. Being Amsterdam only mentioned rural and urban relationships when some European Union project has specifically aims of dealing with these areas. Cardiff is the one of the cases that gives more attention to this relationship, and they talk more on the ways of developing the economy of these rural areas. And others, their discourse is less on rural urban, but more on the how to strengthen small towns and villages, such as in Barcelona and Stockholm, Copenhagen and Edmonton. They seek more ways of controlling this development. And Dublin, also a case that points out specific ways of dealing with these urban-rural developments, as they point out a strategic policy for rural developments, and this is acknowledged in their national document, and then in the urban regional document, or in the urban regional strategic special plan for Dublin, which is prepared in line with the national strategy. So there is a linkage, and there is the acknowledgement of the importance of giving attention at the national level to rural areas as well. And a bit also similar situation in Berlin, where they also acknowledge the importance of the small towns and the rural areas, and they point out ways of developing it further. And the last three cases, they are mainly focused on protecting agricultural lands as a way of stimulating, of boosting the economy of these rural areas. London and Vienna, through the plans we analyzed, they do not specifically focus on rural and urban areas, but certainly eventually they have other documents, or they are preparing the documents, or they are not available online. We could not access information to analyze them. Only three examples: Cardiff, Edmonton, and Pittsburgh, from each of these regional geographies we point out here. Cardiff, in their plan, they specifically mention the urban-rural relationships. They, in one hand, point ways of improving their economies, but also point out ways of avoiding further developments in the countryside. And then they suggest ways of dynamizing these rural areas through the development of rural enterprises, and they point out ways of getting funding to support these areas. In Edmonton, they include sort of something similar to eco-industrial approach to also support a more sustainable development of these rural industrial areas. And in Pittsburgh, what we underline here is these greenways for Pittsburgh, where they intend to preserve the open spaces and build a more fluid relationship between the urban area of Pittsburgh and their rural hinterland. And then specifically Pittsburgh, they talk about community plans more intensively when compared to the other cases, the European cases. So their strategic special plan, as I mentioned in the beginning, works more as a guideline for the community to develop their plans. However, they acknowledge the importance of this, the small village, and they have the preoccupation of motivating the community to develop their plans, keeping in mind the importance of their rural areas as well. To summarizing, to try to provide, and this is the final slide, ways of developing these strategic special plans that can contribute to a more sustainable urban-rural relationship. We point only 4 possible ways. Many others certainly will come through the next steps in this research, through multi-level governance, to the inclusion of not only planning covering economical aspects, but also social aspects, perhaps giving importance to local markets, to local food production, and pointing out ways that these communities can actually, by themselves, through their own resources, boost their economies, the reuse of outdated buildings instead of proposing the construction of new ones, and integrated spatial planning in the sense of developing infrastructures, mainly transportation, that link better and facilitate commuting and exchange of goods and service between urban and rural areas. Only the final example here, trying to cover the multi-level governance and the integrated strategic spatial planning, an example from Scotland, where recently the government requests for the development of this rural planning policy, to contribute to the new Scottish planning policy, which will also contribute to the urban regional plans from Edinburgh, for instance, and Glasgow. So there is already out there some preoccupation or more preoccupation with the rural and urban gradient, but certainly more can be done in this regarding. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Eduardo, for this nice comparative research. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions maximum. Maybe over there.
I would just ask you if you know anything more on what basis did you decide for these 4 ways of
So they are very much justified on our previous research, which covers governance dimensions, or to try to understand what entails to prepare plans, strategic spatial plans, and implement them. So the governance comes in this regarding, and these 4 domains of how to develop strategic spatial planning processes further is pretty much the result of our previous research conducted within this concours project, where we cover the governance, and this, putting it simple, that plans are not prepared by decision makers somewhere, but the result of governance arrangements, formal and informal. It includes the participation of private actors, of ONG, environmental organizations, NGOs, and many other actors. So we point out the governance here, and through that research has been prepared not only through qualitative content analysis, but also through in-depth interviews, and they point out the need of developing a more integrated approach to spatial planning. It means not focus on rural, on urban areas, but also keeping the urban region as a whole in mind, and focus also on these rural areas as they contribute to the development of the urban, of the core center of this urban region.
There was one final question over there, sir.
Thank you. I think your study areas are where greater rural-urban interactions are already stated in the plan. Have you tried it also in the developing countries, for example?
Was not that those developing countries, they were not part of the project, but we are aware of that, and we'll certainly look for examples to then argue our ways to develop strategic spatial planning further. Eventually, that we, of course, do not close that research avenue. We certainly will keep it open, and we would like to explore developing countries, and we are aware of cases, for example, in Africa, trying to develop strategic spatial planning. We have examples from Ghana, we have examples from South Africa. We are aware of them, but at the moment we don't have the right resources to explore them. We'll certainly point out them while writing the manuscript.
Okay, thank you very much. So I don't know whether you do it on purpose, but each time the last question is exactly the step up to the next presentation, because we will move back to Tanzania now, and Saskia Wolff will tell us something about peri-urban land use change in the surroundings of Dar es Salaam.
Yes, thank you. Is this on? Okay. Yes, we are going back to Tanzania. I'm going to present my paper I'm currently writing on peri-urban land use change using a mixed method approach in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. I'm a PhD student at Humboldt University in Berlin, working in the Applied Geoinformation Science Lab. And yes, so you probably know the peri-urban is not a really well-defined area, and especially for the Global South, there's a missing very specific definition. Also, the urban areas mostly expand the administrative areas of a city and are quite dynamic in their growth. So that was already stated like 2 decades ago, and since then research has been going on. On the same hand, it is quite important to conceptualize this peri-urban interface, as it is very important for development policy studies, for instance, especially in the Global South and developing countries. I think, yeah, the conceptualization of this area is important to be able to address processes, especially in urban planning, for instance, or with policy measures. So the first, or one of the research questions I'm going to present now is which spatial characteristics constitute the peri-urban in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Sorry. So Tanzania is, Dar es Salaam, sorry, is one of the fastest growing cities in Africa right now, experiencing also some informal and unregulated growth. And at the same time, due to this growth, facing some social and environmental challenges, because this peri-urban space is, at the one hand, very important for agricultural provision for the city, and on the other hand, of course, an area where settlement development can take place. I chose one specific ward for the case study, which is the Msongola ward, which I now stick with an administrative boundary just because Dar es Salaam has a quite wide range of its city boundaries administratively. And Msongola shows this gradient really nice from a more densely developed area closer to the city to some rural characteristics on the outskirts. It was experiencing a quite dense and high population growth over the last decades, so from approximately 7,000 to almost tripled in 2002, and it tripled within 10 years to almost 24,000. So yes. The methodology I used was a mixed method approach, mixing expert interviews on field and so qualitative measures, but also quantitative methods using spatial data analysis, which was more or less completed by literature research and review, and reviewing documents like the Dar es Salaam Master Plan or Land Acts. So during a field stay in 2017, I conducted some expert interviews whereby the experts were from different administrative levels for once, but also included different functions like town planners, ward executive officers, ward development officers, a school principal, but also researchers and people from the Ministry of Land. On the other hand, for the spatial data analysis, I'm trying to use only open source data, which makes it quite challenging, as you can imagine. So we decided to not use pre-classified land cover data because on this scale, it might not be sufficient enough to only deal with the urban class, but rather we decided to use OpenStreetMap building footprints and a prototype of the Sentinel land cover data. So the building footprints were completed manually, so to say, for the Msongola ward, which is approximately 100 square kilometers during the last year, so on a very highly resoluted spatial scale. And out of this all influencing each other methods came out a list of indicators for the peri-urban, which is by far not complete, but a start, which includes classic land cover and land use indicators, like the natural ones, elevation, slope. You could also include climate, like temperature or rainfall, but also, so we divided the list here into environmental, social, and economic indicators, including some accessibility indicators, proximity to main roads, for instance, or to rivers. Also case study specific, the distance to markets or to local village centers, because the development might take place there more densely than scattered. On the social side, of course, the population, which was more or less represented by the house density in this case, because census data is not really nicely spatially resoluted. The issue of land ownership you could consider as well, as was mentioned already, because there might be a difference between landowner and land user, and of course the land price, which is one of the driving factors for the land use change. So, all in all, most of the interviews also stated, when I asked them to characterize the peri-urban, or to ask what the peri-urban actually means, is the distance to the city center, which is quite obvious and also well known in literature already. For Dar es Salaam, it is in between 20 kilometers but below 40 kilometers of the city center. Other bullet points were the agricultural activity, for instance. What you can see here is vegetable crop production in the river valley, where it happens in Dar es Salaam because you have water there. It's on the one hand for subsistence, but also part of a livelihood strategy to sell vegetable to the city or to the closest markets. Then the peri-urban is mostly characterized through insufficient infrastructures, including the water supply. What you can see on this picture is a newly built water tower. Electricity is an issue, the road network, but not only the distance to close roads, but also the quality. As you can see here as well, it's not a tarmac road, but rather gravel road. So it's also a matter of which quality the roads are. Followed by public transport availability, because in Dar es Salaam people mostly go by public transport with the buses, dala-dalas, which are small buses, but the stops only reach so far, and after that people have to switch to walking or using the motorbike, cycle, taxi. And of course, social services, like a lack of schools and hospitals. And as mentioned already, most of the areas face a lack of planning, which leads to these structures. What you can see here are these brick walls, which you see a lot, also just stapled up bricks at the roadside, because people buy the land, put up any structure of a house just to make sure it's theirs. But sometimes houses are then not finished by building. So to give you an exemplary case, so we found different indicators representing this gradient really nicely. What you can see here for the house density, you can see the gradient really nice. So it's explained by the distance to the city center quite nicely. Which is the case for the house density, for example, the tree cover percentage, or the mean road length per square kilometer on this. So each of these grid cells is 1 square kilometer. But on the other hand, you also have continuous indicators, which is shown through these lighter blue dots, which represent the mean house size, which doesn't change along this gradient. Yes, so as mentioned, the house density shows a decreasing gradient. The tree cover percentage, on the other hand, is increasing, as you can imagine. But then there are also those random indicators which show no specific pattern or gradient, like the distance to the river, because it's dependent on environmental circumstances. So to come up with a first idea of the conceptualization, you could say that you have these 4 different categories of indicators. The decreasing one, for example, the house density or road density, increasing ones like the tree coverage or partage of agricultural land. Then we have indicators which show no change in dependence of the distance to the city center, like the house size or the distance to roads. And the 4th category, which is the random one, mostly dependent on natural elements. So to conclude, and this is only a short excerpt of the analysis, obviously, the outlook, or it would be nice to generalize these characteristics. Of course, they are always spatially explicit and can differ for different regions. then it would be nice to add a temporal component, as you can imagine. Since we are talking about change, this is somehow necessary. Because in the long run, we want to be able to model this peri-urban land use change, or the urban expansion in the Global South, so to say. Yeah, and be able to support this sustainable development for cities with insufficient planning, like Dar es Salaam. Yes, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, Saskia, well in time. Thank you. Questions for Saskia on this topic? Yes.
I have a question. When you talked about insufficient infrastructure,
Yes.
is that compared with the urban or also compared with the rural?
That's a good question. It's both, so to say. So the rural might have the same characteristics, obviously, and it doesn't exclude that the urban itself provides these infrastructures in a really good way. But during these interviews and talking with the people there, that was the most mentioned problems, especially if you consider like schools and hospitals, which are provided better in an urban area. And maybe even in a rural area because you just don't have to consider that many people.
Okay, more questions? Actually, I have a question for already a decade. We have been doing research together with Professor Schweib-Loaza on Kampala. And there what we see is that there is a clear link between the suburbanization and the social segregation. So that you have a specific social class that ends up in the suburban areas. Is that also in Dar es Salaam or not?
Yes, more or less. However, it is not that easy to explain because most of the landowners are middle income. So I was rather expecting, because of the informal settlement expansion, also having low income people there, which is also true, but the landowners are more middle income. Yeah. But of course they bring their families, which are then considered low income. So
that's also what we see to a certain extent in Kampala, where the extreme poor are so poor that they cannot even afford the public transport to the city center. So for them, it's not an interesting place to live, but it's more the poor or the middle class that.
Exactly, that's quite the same.
That's the
for
same.
Dar es Salaam.
Okay,
yes.
Very interesting. Yes, another question.
I will just put your guidance to some work done by a previous PhD student of ours, Fenna Otten, who sort of studied exactly the peri-urban or sub-urbanization taking place in Dar es Salaam in 4 different areas.
Nice.
And I think her answer would be that they are moving in particular to those places where there's no transport because the land is cheaper in the expectations of transport to arrive. So it's all this kind of, you know,
feedback circle,
of service provision, and this incremental building of areas as you're showing here. So what we are having in some of our papers is really discussing this about, is it peri-urban or is it suburban? How should we really see it? Should we see it as a kind of an in-between or really an expansion of the city? And I think that's an interesting discussion.
Definitely, yeah. And what you mentioned is this already putting the words out there, peri-urban or suburban, because it's hard to differentiate. And if you consider the peri-urban as a mix of land uses, this is not really the case for this case study, for example, because it's mainly settlement areas and residential. So the overall definition not even applies here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Saskia.
Thank you.
So now we'll come to the end of this session with 2 flashes talks. The first one is on rural transformations in Sumatra by Fenna Otten. Yes. So flash talk is 3 minutes, but the discussion time is the same, I think. Just 3, yeah.
Well, welcome. My name is Fenna. I'm working at the University of Göttingen in a collaborative research center called Efforts on the Landscape Transformation in the face of oil palm expansions. And today I will present you my results concerning the spatial and temporal heterogeneity and the landscape transformations in Jambi province, our research area in Sumatra. So Sumatra is well known for an unprecedented oil palm expansion throughout the last year, mainly related to a globally increasing demand for palm oils. And initial investigations revealed that this transformation has taken place very heterogeneous, different between villages and also in time. And so that landscape mosaic has evolved. And in some places, oil palm plantations, monocultures are dominant, while in others, vast rubber forests can characterize the area. And in between, there's still some remnants of paddy farming or horticulture. So I hypothesized that the transformation takes place along a rural-urban continuum, like in proximity to urban centers and markets. That means that that the agricultural transformation lies on a conceptual transect, and I tried to grasp this transect with the 9 villages. Where conducted qualitative research on case study basis with the aim to reveal relations and the respective flows, including rural-urban relations. And the research was complemented with expert interviews based in Jambi city. So coming to the results, there are 4 aspects we identified as important factors, and each of these comes into being through specific relations and the flows, like, for example, migration with the dissemination of ideas and lifestyles. So in the following, I will just pick out 2, the rural-urban and the transnational cooperations. So, and here, regarding the proximity, research has shown that the agricultural landscape is transformed particularly due to the urban demand for food. And especially in villages close to the urban areas, there's more food production than in others. Second, that's what's not depicted here, is the urban sprawl into rural surroundings. For example, the new airport building has displaced local farmers into the outer villages, or residential estates which have been built in the theme park. And then irrelevant of urban proximity, a transnational cooperation network is transforming the 30 Hills landscape, where the Michelin Group with their Indonesian partner Barito Pacific managed a 60,000 hectare concession cultivating rubber monocultures. And this led to severe transformations of agricultural practices and everyday life of local farmers, creating a new frontier with altered property rights and land access regimes. So concluding, then I would say that generally social networks proved more important than spatial proximity, especially if we consider that that social relations are also crucial for rural-urban links. Thus, we build on the concept of translocality to explain for the landscape mosaic, where we say that translocal actors very often have a strong influence on landscape transformation, even though relations span over vast distances, like, for example, in Indonesian family networks, political elites networks from local to national level, and many other examples. So finally, rural-urban places are definitely interrelated, but the continuum cannot be found in Jambi province for the broad regional transformation, so that more complex actor networks have created countless translocal assemblages that all together create the landscape mosaic of Jambi. Thank you.
Okay, that was a very nice flash talk. We have time for questions. It's not flash questions. We can have the same kind of questions as for the other talks. Yes.
Sorry if I missed it, but I don't understand what you mean by translocal.
Translocal means that the actors are not all locally bound. They are not all in that village, in that space where the transformation takes place, so that their relations and connections to other places be that in Indonesia or across the globe. It's just not only local. The influence into that landscape or into that village landscape where the agricultural transformation takes place cannot be traced back to only local factors.
Local factors, but not local people.
Well, local people is also a factor, I would say. Like it includes.
But that's different if the transformation comes imported with an agent, or if it's the locality is just influenced by external factors. That's what I'm trying to understand.
So in the overall framing, I include the relations and flows, and one of these relations is the migration, like people coming into that place, but it's also the relation to an economic relation, like the market demand. That can also be a very different relation, but it has special impact on that place. So I don't reduce the relation to simply people or agents. Of course, all these relations are transferred via agents, but they don't have to migrate to that place. They don't have to come there, be there.
Okay, maybe time for one more question, or yes?
How you specifically identify that social networks are more important than the spatial proximity? Or which methods you use?
I used qualitative case studies where I interviewed people from unstructured to semi-structured and expert interviews in combination with participant observation. So I spent several days and weeks in the villages. And based on the 9 research villages, I conclude that for those villages, the spatial proximity is such, like in the last example of the transnational actor cooperation, cannot explain on the regional scale the transformation that takes place in Jambi province.
Okay, thank you. Also a flash applause. And then we come to the final talk, also a flash talk by Daniele Ehrlich on a data compendium for land use change analysis. Is it correct? Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay. Hello. Yes, can you hear me? Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Daniele Ehrlich. I have 3 minutes, right? So thank you, first of all, to the organizers to give me this opportunity to present our work. This is really about data for you to use possibly for analyzing the urban-rural interface. And we are just showing to you these data sets here, which is global built-up, as was presented also before. And we have 4 layers of this for 1975, 90, 2000, 2015. And we have equivalent population density maps that come with it. Jasper has presented this the analysis of how he has used this data set for China. So it was a nice introduction. Why we are doing this is because we have asked to partition this built-up into settlements classes, okay? So in urban and rural areas. And this presentation is about telling you about this. We are working, this is for international organization that are trying to come up with a new system of classifying urban and rural, because as you know, every country has a different definition. And we need to have standardized ways of analyzing data across the globe. So this is based on remote sensing. These are the buildings, oops, here. These are the buildings, and then out of the buildings, we create density of built up, which is density of, as I said, built up. And this is at 250 meters. Jasper has produced this at 2 kilometers. We typically analyze this at 1 kilometer. So this is the built up, but the second layer, very important one that I'm not showing, I'm just showing is the population density, which superimposed perfectly with the built up. And those two layers are the ones that help us to identify a new degree of urbanization. So out of these two layers, we produce this partitioning of the built-up and population into urban centers, urban clusters, and rural areas. These are the criteria. don't have the time to go to the criteria, but just to tell you that the entire settlements of or built-up of the globe is partitioned into three classes. And we have not stopped here. We go even a level beyond. So these are the three levels, but we have already defined city, towns, suburbs, villages, dispersed area, mostly uninhabited areas. But if you want to know more about this, I'm happy to talk to you more after or at coffee. And out of we have identified 13,000 urban centers. And this can be visualized, and you can analyze it on our website. Just type Global Human Settlement Layers. You get the website, and you can identify and get information about these urban centers. And each urban center has information about population, geography, precipitation, storm, surge, disaster risk, and so on and so on. So we encourage you to go and look at our data if you're interested. And the most important to say is all of this work has been mostly pushed on us to be able to define SDGs indicators that do need a definition of urban area. And with that concludes my presentation of 3 minutes, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes, questions. Thank you. Thank you. Well in time with this flash presentation. So
Flash presentation.
Thank you for this presentation. There are sort of several groups trying to do what
Sure.
you're doing.
Sure.
So
We have here.
just explain what's exceptional about or special about you compared to others, just so we get an idea about.
So first, we have done it in 4 time slices, 75, 2000, 2015, and 2000, 2015. And the methodology is consistent, so you are able to compare in space and time. Second, out of that is the population density, which comes also 75, 2090, 2000, 2015. And third, out of that, because of all of this, we are able to develop indicators in time. The sustainable development indicators that you could not do otherwise. And the degree of urbanization that defines urban areas is an essential part of that. If you don't have the urban definition, you cannot measure the indicators. Those two ingredients make it special.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very clear answer, I think. Another question?
Excellent data set. I just recently used it in the
Yeah.
but I just want to understand how long it takes.
How long it takes?
To do all this.
Well, let's say the research that has gone into that is decades. Because the extraction of information from a satellite image takes decades. But now we have summarized everything, and the last things we have done in the last 5 years. So basically, we have produced those products. Yeah. But maybe very important to say, because you are very much local users. This is for global application. But we have a solution also that your products at very fine scale, at the building level, at 1/5000 scale, can be consistently aggregated with these scales, because our definition of built up is consistent. It can be applied also at imagery at 1 meter resolution or 50 centimeters resolution. And this is maybe the most important innovation.
Thank you. More questions? If not, I think thank you, Daniele.
You're welcome.
For your contribution.
Thank you.
Good. This brings us to the end of this session. I think it was very interesting with various perspectives on rural-urban interfaces. But the topic is not over yet on this conference, because tomorrow we will continue in a second session on this topic. So I think at that moment we can do a wrap-up. Now it's a bit too early, I guess. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all back tomorrow. So thank you very much. Thanks, speakers, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.